Hi, and welcome to Post-Burnout.com interviews. Post-Burnout.com is a culture website dedicated to venerating burnt-out artists the world over. My name is Aaron Kavanagh, and I'm the website's founder and editor-in-chief. This is our website's podcast where we interview people from various artistic disciplines. These episodes are sometimes full-length interviews from our site's articles and other times exclusives. If you're a returning listener, thanks for coming back. And if you're new here, thanks for checking us out. We hope you'll like it and stick around with us. In this edition of Post-Burnout.com interviews, we speak with the Irish musician Glen Brady. Glen talks about his latest musical project, Def Nettle, their upcoming debut album, DF001, collaborating with Andy Rourke on a song on the album, working as a producer for Andy and Dolores O'Riordan, combining hip-hop and punk, how Def Nettle is a full-circle moment for him, his background between New York and Ireland growing up, becoming a DJ in the 90s and being part of the Irish rave scene, and more.
How are you doing?
Okay.
Morning.
I'm good yourself, man. It's very nice to talk with you.
Oh, you too. What's your name again?
Aaron.
Aaron Glenn. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, man.
Where are you?
In Dublin.
Okay, cool. I'm down in Wexford myself
Okay,
right
cool.
now. But yeah. Many years in Dublin.
Well, actually, the first thing I was going to ask was, I actually want to know a little bit about your background because, as I was kind of like reading, through it, I mean, it seemed like you were kind of constantly kind of in a new location. I was just wondering generally, like, what was your kind of like background, and what was your kind of background in music as well?
Sure. So as a kid, I moved back and forth from the States a lot. My parents were very typical Irish immigrants of the 60s, so my sister was born in the States, but they were here for a year, so I was born here, but then went back to the States for a lot of primary school.
Hmm.
And then when we got to secondary school, we all moved back to Ireland, and used to spend the summers in New York because my father was there. So kind of a bit of both, and part of the Irish American community in New York growing up a little bit, even though I went to secondary and college in Ireland. Spent my 20s in Dublin, where I was a DJ, and in that kind of time when DJing was a big thing then, in a
Yeah.
sense. Um, and that's when I started programming, sampling, and messing around in studios, and spent a lot of time learning engineering and stuff like that. Buying equipment, desks and samplers and keyboards, and started collecting then, in the mid to late 90s. That's when I really started doing things. And my teenage years, I suppose, were a lot of kind of alternative music and indie and stuff like that. And then, the rave scene kind of hit, and that was a thing. But I was always pretty into hip hop. So when I was DJing in the 90s, I was kind of a hip hop DJ, even though I had a lot of taste in indie and rock and things like that, and experimental stuff. And yeah, that's when I started making records, was mid to late 90s, doing kind of electronic music and instrumental hip hop records, initially on small Dublin labels and some London-based labels at the time, some stuff on a New York label, which I ended up releasing on for probably 20 years or so, on and off. And then, towards the end of the 90s, as that scene kind of died out, I'd always intended to move back to New York anyway at some point. And I'd kind of outgrown what I could do here in Ireland in the 90s. Things were a little different. It was pre-social media. I'd played all the festivals, been a resident at a lot of the clubs in Dublin at the time, and kind of felt like I needed to branch out. And so I moved to New York. I think it was 2001. Yeah, it was. It was about a month before 9/11. I moved to New York. And the label I had released on, Plant Music, had kind of grown. They had a bar and a scene downtown there at the time. So I kind of got into that a little bit and started a band called The Glass with one of the owners of Plant Music. And that took me through the 2000s. We were signed to 4Music in Germany, and we did a lot of touring and this, that, and the other. All the while I was DJing a lot in New York, and I was engineering by day in studios in New York, did a lot of hip hop engineering, a lot of off Broadway, and classical music stuff as well. That was paying the bills,
Yeah.
and that was good. I worked at a studio there that it was pretty flexible. I could go on tour if I wanted. It was owned by musicians, so did a lot of touring in Europe in the 2000s, like 2002 to 2008 or nine. Through being in the Glass and on For Music in Germany and Plant Music in New York, and so kind of developed relationships in Germany at the time because we'd rent an apartment in Berlin for the summer. Things were pretty cheap back then, and then we'd tour from there. And I guess at one point I was like starting to release again as DJ Wool, which had been a name I used in the 90s, and so started putting stuff out on European labels like Disco Bell in Sweden, and My Techno Weighs a Ton in Finland, and a couple other smaller London labels. And so I started to see the ability to stay in Europe, and I was a little over New York at that point. There'd been a lot of partying and a lot of ups and downs, and so I went and lived in Germany and Berlin for about 5 years, like 2008 to 2012, something like that, and really DJ'd a lot at that stage. Kind of burnt myself out, and really wanted to return to engineering and stuff like that. And an opportunity came to join the Stagehands Union in California. My wife was from there, and I'd been going back and forth, and I had some connections there. So, and I had been DJing a few nights a week for 20 years. So, that's when I moved to California. I suppose that was 2011 or 12, something like that. And I had kids then and got married, and so I engineered for a few years there for the union, Stagehands Union in San Francisco. So that was like kind of the first time I'd done a real job and kind of gave the DJing a break. I'll always love DJing, but I've kind of felt like evolving from it a little, and being out till, in Berlin, you're out till 9 a.m,
Yeah.
which is great. But, you reach a point where, for me, taking music seriously was important, and I knew I could learn a lot if I got into that union. And so I did that for several years. However, during that time, I ended up being contacted by Dolores from the Cranberries, and I ended up engineering an album for her and Andy Rourke from the Smiths called Dark. And then that kind of took me on another turn. I ended up touring that and supporting the Cranberries in 2017, and that's when I ended up coming back to Ireland. And it was nice to come home after 16 years, I think I was away, and to reconnect here was pretty cool. And my wife liked Ireland a lot, which was nice. And we've been here ever since. And it was during that time that, I work on a fair bit of hip hop still, in the States, production and engineering, mixing and different things. And it was while doing that during the pandemic that I started Def Nettle. I was working on a record for someone, and they weren't sure what they wanted. They sometimes wanted a jazzy record, sometimes wanted a rocky record, and they ended up going for the jazzy tracks. And I was left with a few of kind of punky tracks I liked, and I ended up doing the vocals myself. I've been doing vocals on and off my whole life, so it wasn't as big a jump as maybe it might seem from a lot of other things I was doing. I've always been writing anyway, so I just thought, while I'm still at almost young enough to do it, I'll give it a shot and have some fun with that, and start a band again. And kind of I was missing that rehearsal space feeling, and being on stage and all of that. So I started Def Nettle then about 3 years ago now, that I kind of formed it. We released the first thing 2 years ago, and it'll be 2 years in February since our first release. So it took about a year for the tracks to come together and to find that sound. And then the last 2 years has been like, I started it on my own pretty much. Although, I've had a lot of characters that have been fairly consistent in the recording, like Jay Oglesby on drums, Eli Siegel on bass, and Lisa Doyle, who does secondary vocals just full vocals with me on the tracks. So that's become a full band now. So there's Damien Fox on drums, guy called Ronnie Carroll on guitar. He was well known for doing plenty of bands over the years, but Grouse would have been one that did pretty well. So that's the kind of live setup now. So the first album was a match of loads of different musicians, and the album's coming out in February. I'm primarily writing the songs, but all those guys have been involved in different areas of writing and being part of the making of the album. Yeah, and that's out in February, and I'm hoping the second album will be much more a cohesive. Not that the first album's incohesive, but in terms of the characters playing on it. I'd like to have the live band making this record, and that's kind of what I'm focused on once I get this album out. There's
There's
a
a lot to
road.
well, there's a lot to go from there. I guess I guess like as you were kind of mentioned that kind of like traveling between kind of Ireland and New York as a kid. I mean, like how did you find like the music scenes like in those two places kind of like influence what you would do later? Because actually one thing that was interesting, I took note of you on the song Invisible, for example, you mentioned the Virgin Prunes. I think they're kind of a good like if I was to kind of like say like what a pretender for what Def Nettle would be, I think they're not the worst example. So I
Yeah,
was wondering, did like the how the kind of like scenes when it came to like traveling between the two places kind of like influence what you would do
yeah,
later?
it's an interesting point you found because especially this week because I was a skateboarder and there's a skate shop in Dublin closing down this week after 40 years in business. And the owner of the skate shop, Clive, grew up on the same street as Bono and Gavin Friday and all those characters. And so that was kind of around me as a teenager in Dublin.
Yeah.
There was Clive's brother Pete was the boy that was on the cover of U2's Boy album, and his brother would be Googie, the artist who was in the Virgin Prunes. So definitely they were around as I was a teenager, and I was almost too young in a sense for them. But they were definitely something I listened to as a teenager and kept, in my pocket in a sense. I think I spent a year in Philadelphia when I was 19 before I went to college, and I went to two shows that summer that I think Def Nettle is those two shows.
Okay.
It was a band called the Butthole Surfers from
Oh
Texas.
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And the Beastie Boys Check Your Head tour, where they
Okay.
played all their live instruments and they swapped instruments during the show. And those two concerts kind of always stayed with me as kind of being a benchmark. If I ever was in an album that was just, or in a band that I was designing, that those two concerts would be the benchmark of what I wanted to do you know so that would have been my influence in the States, and in over here it would have been the likes of early U2 and the characters around that. And let me think. I'm on the spot for the bands that were around at the time, but Virgin Prunes would be a very good one. The Golden Horde would have been another one that were in
Yeah.
Ireland at the time that I would have went to see. So they would have had some kind of influence now, maybe more so in all those years, less so in those years when I was a DJ and when I was just producing and that sort of thing. It's kind of a full circle thing, isn't it? When I've kind of come back to where I started musically, and that's kind of related to spending those intervening 20 years learning the craft,
Yeah.
and learning how music is made and written and lyrics are brought out and come through you, and how to craft that. So I think, like, in a sense, though I made a lot of records in those 20 years and I collaborated with a lot of people and was remixed a lot of well-known acts. Maybe this now is a full circle moment,
Yeah.
for sure. It was cool that you mentioned that because the song Invisible was written. I was listening to the audiobook or Bono's audiobook,
Yeah.
and
Surrender.
I had a conversation with an old friend from that time who's very he'd be a little bit cynical,
Sure.
and Invisible was kind of the song was kind of written 10 minutes after I had a conversation with him about the book, because he was so viscerally in hate of the book. And I quite enjoyed especially the first half of the book, because it talked about all those early years and I knew some of the characters when I was a teenager, so that was kind of cool for me. So the song is really it's really the conversation I had with him.
Okay.
Yeah, about that time and about that book, and yeah.
Actually, one thing I'm kind of interested to pick your brain about a little bit. You mentioned the Beastie Boys, and I think like when we think of like the Beastie Boys, like people think of like License to Ill, they think of like Paul's Boutique and stuff. But they actually started as a hardcore band in the early '80s. I was wondering what do you think of that style, like their initial style?
Um, I don't think I differentiate that much between that and what they ultimately did because, I used to spend my teenage years in New York in the summers. So I would be in boarding school here, and then I would go out and stay with my dad in the late '80s over there. And when hip hop came out, when punk rock came out, you know, they probably had a lot more in common that than you would seem now. So a lot of the clubs that they were playing were the same clubs. So inevitably, the crowds were mixing, and the styles of music were mixing. And I always think it's interesting. There's a really good book called Last Night a DJ Saved My Life about the evolution of DJing globally, but has at the end of the book it has all of the set lists from the late 70s up to the early 90s of the kind of preeminent DJs of the time. And I think what's interesting if you look at it is some of the big gay clubs, some of the punk clubs, post-punk clubs, and the hip-hop clubs, probably they were playing the same top 10 records,
Right. Yeah.
you know, ESG and certain funk covers and
Yeah.
Talking Heads. And so there was a really the music, although it seems very different, I think this is so true for Def Nettle. A lot of the verses are very rappy.
Yeah.
I wouldn't call it hip hop, but I would definitely say they have a hip hop influence. I mean, I do go for more indie and melodic stuff on a lot of the songs, but song like The Pills or Boat Race, these are rap tunes as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
Um, and so I think like hip hop and punk rock have so much in common.
Yeah.
Even aesthetically, the fact that you can make them in your bedroom kind of thing. You don't need a lot of equipment in punk. You might need a guitar, a bass, and drums and a mic. And in hip hop, the phrase two turntables and a microphone. A drum machine and a mic. These are very what's the word? They're very simple approaches, and it's always good to bring these things in and record them properly. But I think in essence, they don't have. There's not that much difference in a way. It's people just making art out of what found art, making art out of what's around, out of their words and what they can say. And it's not, although there's genius in hip hop and punk rock, but sometimes the most simple and things made without much intention musically can be really profound. And I mean, I'd like to think that's true with Def Nettle, but I'll leave that up
Yeah.
to everyone else. Yeah, I'm sure it's true for me anyway in writing it.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah,
Actually, but that's an interesting point too. You were kind of mentioning like the idea of like they would share the venues. I think that's similar here in Ireland, and perhaps that was due maybe to a limitation of venues. But you think of places like McGonagall's, or you think of places like the Ormond, where you could see like a DJ one night and then Fugazi the next, or Sir
yeah,
Henry's in Cork and stuff.
yeah.
And it seems like we have like a very similar kind of lineage too, which people don't really, I guess, really appreciate. It seems like now venues are probably a little more fragmented into genre.
Segregated into
Yeah,
different
kind of.
styles. Yeah. Yeah, I often wonder about that because um, I was just as happy going to a punk show as I was going to a rave or
Yeah,
going to see, whatever hip hop acts were available to see at the time in Ireland. And I enjoyed them to the same level, and I didn't differentiate between them in a sense. It was about how it made you feel. Maybe things have evolved to become a bit more purist or something, but at the same time, if I look at some of the venues like Whelan's upstairs Bears or the Workmans or whatnot, you can easily see a pop artist, a funk artist, a death metal band, a live electronic act in any of those. You
Yeah.
know, so there still is some crossover, but yeah, it's interesting. I think I think we're lucky in a sense that it's separated because um, I don't know, with dance music in general, it's kind of evolved to a new stage again in Ireland where it went from the clubs to the festivals, and now it's to kind of super clubs in a lot of way.
Yeah.
Um, so there's these large venue clubs, and I think really depending on where you are as an artist, dictates where you're going to play. So if you have that commercial success, you're going to get the bigger venue, and so yeah, I don't know if anybody notices that it's all different kinds of music in these places, or do people just do the same people go to a punk rock show that go to a dance show that go to a hip hop show? I think so. I think there's a lot of people who like it all still.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, hope
See,
so.
one thing I wonder actually, well, is like, I kind of think of like how, just in general, I mean, like, I think people's like, and I think actually the album you were mentioning, DN001,
Yeah.
which your upcoming album, I think it kind of like touches on a lot of the kind of like, to me, it had a real air of like a critique of kind of like modern living in a lot of ways. And one thing I think is interesting, like, I wonder, are people gonna eventually get maxed out financially from being able to have kind of live experiences that maybe they once had? Because it seems like not only the ticket prices themselves are going up, and also transporting out the city, as well as like drinks and stuff like that. I feel, or even merchandise and stuff. It feels like I wonder, would people be more willing to take a risk on new music if the financial incentive was kind of lower?
Yeah, it's interesting. We're doing a launch on February 8th in Whelan's. And I was really like, talking to the band and to Whelan's themselves. I was really like, because I don't really feel like I'm going to make any money out of it anyway. It's not what I'm really doing it for.
Sure.
And so I wanted to like keep the price at a tenner. I wanted it to be a reasonable entry. I
Hmm.
wanted it to be like, yeah, all right, you can pay a tenner because unfortunately you do have to take transport into town. You do have to have a drink or something to eat and live life when you're out there, and it's super expensive. It's crazy.
Hmm.
I gave up drinking about 5 years ago, so it makes it a little simpler for me because I just drive to Dublin and I drive home.
Right. Yeah.
I try to go to show once a month at least. And I always at this point I noticed the other day people are asking me, I did one interview, they were asking me what my favorite shows were last year, and or over the last while, and it was all I could tell you was small Irish bands because that's all I went to see.
Yeah.
you know and it wasn't financial, it was just like I just didn't feel like being crammed into somewhere and for this like big light show basically. I
Yeah.
preferred like being up at the front, and being in communication with the band, and that's why I like venues like the Workman's or all of this smaller venues where you're up close because you feel like you're contributing to the scene a little bit. Like I'm happy to pay in to see an Irish band, and I'm happy to buy a t-shirt when I'm there
Yeah.
because it's and I'm not being corny either. Like I actually do like doing that because um I like to see them being supported.
Right.
It's cool to me, and I'm not that I was never that interested in stuff that was blowing up.
Right.
All the
Yeah.
bands I've talked about and the things I was into, like even the Beasties, they seem like a huge band, but when they played in Ireland that summer, 1992 or three, it was in the Tivoli for 500
Yeah.
people. It was packed and it was mental, but
Yeah.
it wasn't like 80,000 people that they eventually would play for, or I don't even know. I'm sure they played massive shows in Ireland, just I can't recall right now which ones they were. um so yeah, for me it's about, I really like being up close, and what I've noticed about these venues is um like some of the punk shows there's kids who are in their late teens, early 20s, and there's dudes in their 60s,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and they're mingling and mixing and they know each other and it's a good vibe and it's not like there's not a wall between the ages. They're just there for a good buzz and that's why I like Fibbers again after 30 years. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I like places where it's like chill and you can talk to everybody there, you know, and people are like you bump into somebody and then you end up being friends with them, you know.
Yeah.
It's not like someone bumps into you and goes, "Oh my God, who's that? Who, you know, I don't, that guy doesn't dress like me, or he's younger than me, or she's older than me, or." So that's why I'm enjoying a lot of the scene with people like the Nils and the Skunts from Belfast and Meryl Streep and you know people
Yeah.
like I like going to shows like that because um, there's just a general collectiveness of decency and communication there and you know maybe that's just me being optimistic because I am optimistic but
Yeah.
that's how I feel when I go whereas if I go to I don't want to call out any venues because I'm not into being negative about anything but you know if I go to a much bigger venue in Dublin for an act that's you know got all the right marketing and all the right PR even if they started good but they're you know they're on all the right playlists and
Yeah.
everybody wants to go see them um, I don't ever make friends at those shows.
Yeah.
People are with their friends, they're there to see the band, and then they're gone, you
It's a
know?
very isolating experience, kind of.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean the music's not amazing because it
Sure.
usually is. But I, you know, I find a lot of those shows are just about the light show now, and when I go to music, I want to leave a venue because I'll go on my own a lot.
Yeah.
I'll be like, fuck it, I want to see this band, I'm just gonna go on my own, and I've never gone to a show in Dublin on my own and not left knowing some people, you know, like whether
Sure.
I know someone I get there that introduces me to someone or, you know, and you know, that's kind of what I want to do with this band is play those venues, you know, and you're always under this pressure to like market it properly and you know are you the right age and you know are you taking the right steps in the right order you know are you in the right festival that propels you on to the next festival and there's all this pressure to do everything right where I don't know I mean I try but you know at the end of the day you're just trying to be creative too so focusing too much on that can really take away from the songs and from why you're doing it and I've been at it for you know 25 years so I think I have the experience to know that longevity doesn't come from planning. You know, maybe that'll get you in the right chart and get you on the right European tour for a year or two. But how many bands and artists do we know that get there and are completely bummed out and don't want to be there and look like they don't appreciate it, you know?
Yeah.
So I'd rather just like continue to make really good songs and play small venues and have fun and meet new people and keep it going as long as I can, you know?
Yeah, I wonder is that actually kind of irrespective of like, just kind of like, because you're kind of like doing this, it seems as like something that's like of legitimate interest to you is something that's just a creative project for you. But like, other people are like their concern is making it quote unquote, and that does mean the bigger venues. It means the playlist, it means getting on TV and stuff. You mentioned actually the Nils. I saw them at you mentioned the Tivoli, the bar opposite there,
Okay,
Drop Dead
yeah.
Twice, which is
Yeah, it
I
burned
think
down,
seven
didn't it?
floors. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that place, but that was like a mental show, and again, you kind of get that feeling that like they weren't trying to be anything bigger than playing there to the crowd, and the crowd was very receptive, like it was a mental show.
Oh, it's
Um,
brilliant.
and I wonder is that kind of like just the perspective that comes from you have a kind of like sense of freedom once you kind of like get rid of that idea of like I'm trying to be the next big thing or something.
Yeah, I think the Nils are a great example of a good band, you
Yeah,
know, and they're progressing anyway, you know. So, you know, I had a conversation with somebody in the punk scene there from Ireland who was saying who had some workout, and he was saying he's more of a folk artist, but he relates to that scene. And he was saying, well, you know, on my new, I don't want to say his name because, you know, I don't want to put anyone in position, but he was saying, you know, on my new record, I decided to just make the vinyl, put up some posters, and go old school, call up my friends, let my people know, not focus too much on just getting all the right Spotify plays and release radars and all that. And he said the interesting thing was that, within 6 months, he went from 50, 100 people to 150, 200 people at his gig, you
Yeah.
know? So, and that was just by like doing it kind of old school in a way. People are buying his 7 inches, you know, rather than, just focusing on the streaming. I know it's important, but, it's interesting if you watch who immediately gets 10,000 plays and who doesn't. And it's usually someone who fits into the right category politically right now, or, what's thought to be the correct thing for us all to be focusing on. It's not necessarily because it's particularly great music, you know?
Right.
And that doesn't mean that there isn't great music doing really well, but I think that there's a number of ways to skin a cat, and you really have to know what you want from it. And I mean, we all fall into the trap of being like, oh, this, I'm not getting the streams, I'm not doing this, But on this one, I've been really like trying to avoid worrying about any of that too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I want to talk a little bit. You mentioned the production work you were doing. When it comes to Def Nettle, I mean, like I think like well, actually, first of all, I wanted to ask simply was like when it came to DJing and when it came to the side production and mixing and things like that, was that self-trained, or were you kind of like formally trained either through like an education, or was it information that's
All,
just passed out?
all self-trained.
Yeah,
Going into studios in the 90s and asking questions,
yeah,
and um yeah, done out of necessity. When I left college, I got a bank loan and I bought a 24 channel desk, a sampler, and an effects rack. I had a computer, but at the time they just ran MIDI. So
yeah,
so you'd have to trigger keyboards and samplers from MIDI and straight into the desk. So that was how I began. And there was a group of people doing that type of stuff in Dublin. Leo Pearson, who's a producer, he was one of them. So he had a bit more gear than me. So I learned a bit by going to his space, and various other. I ended up in various studios around Dublin at the time, just sitting in the corner asking questions. Um, DJing was self-taught. I was into scratching, that sort of stuff. You didn't find out on the internet back then. You had to go watch DJs, how mixing and scratching was done. I was picking up guitars, keyboards, and that sort of thing during that time, but I didn't really focus on musicianship. It was more about engineering. In the 90s. And then when I moved to New York in 2001 was when I got much more focused as a musician, playing guitars and keyboards and drums, and got more into the musical side of it as opposed to just the engineering and programming. And I felt that had been missing in my own personal education. So I spent a few years, I mean, I'm still studying that every day.
yeah,
So I think again, like, because I started from I always say the first instrument I learned was a drum machine. I was in a band in college and I was doing vocals very like Def Nettle. And that was before I ever started DJing. So that I ended up inheriting a drum machine from that band. And, the vocals were very influenced by those two shows I had seen when I was 19 before I went to college. And I guess I didn't feel until I started doing this 20 years later that I had the musical kind of chops to go it on my own. So a lot
yeah,
of those years, but I got lucky. I engineered for a lot of bands. I watched a lot of good musicians. I worked with a lot of good musicians. I had a lot of people teach me along the way. So it wasn't on my own, but it wasn't formal education at all. I mean, that wasn't even available for engineers back then, in a sense. And
yeah.
I had one engineer tell me in New York, he's like, "Oh, if somebody studied engineering, I'm not hiring them." And at the time that made sense,
Yeah.
not so much anymore because it's gotten better. But no, it was self-taught, everything along the way.
Yeah, and that's kind of cool. It's like it's similar to the kind of like you were mentioning the kind of communal aspect of like the punk and skate scenes as well. Because I remember like like people would go to say like the skate shop on Hill Street, and it would just be kind of like you know
That's the one I was
someone would
talking
come
about
in,
that goes down.
yeah,
Yeah,
and people just kind of be like, yeah, helping like young kids, like like learn skating and stuff like that. It's a
yeah,
very similar aspect. When it came to Def Nettle, then like I mean, when it actually came to kind of like the production side of the record, I think it has a very, I wouldn't say lo-fi, but it's kind of like no, it doesn't feel like overly produced, but like there is a lot of like very subtle production tricks that are going through the entire thing. I was wondering if maybe you could talk about that aspect.
sure. One thing I wanted to keep in mind with this was that there may not be a budget initially for creating a touring situation, and as someone who's engineered a long time, especially for my years in the California as an engineer for the stagehands union, um, I really wanted to be able to just walk on stage, plug in and play
Yeah,
without any huge sound checks. I wanted to be able to go on a bill with five other bands if necessary, without creating a big fuss for the engineer and flexing my engineering muscles by bringing a fucking spaceship on stage, which I'm very capable of doing because I have all
right.
the equipment. But I didn't want to do that. I want to make it like it, and as well as the vocalist, I want to be able to walk on, perform, and walk off.
Yeah,
I don't want to have to sweat plugging stuff in for 2 hours, figuring out how it's all going to sound, having the stress of it not working. Um, I wanted to be able to just and so I wrote the songs with that in mind.
yeah,
I definitely made the songs with that in mind. However, I do have a bunch of synthesizers and modular rigs and too much equipment. So I did use some of that in the production of it. I like synth sounds and things like that. So there's definitely and I'm a programmer first. So like I said, when I started, I bought a desk, a sampler, and some effects. I didn't buy a guitar first and an amp. So there's definitely a lot of little bits and bobs of programming in there, as you correctly pointed out. And there's some modular synth stuff happening in the backgrounds and things like that. And it comes back to how I start the songs. I either start the songs on an acoustic guitar or I start them on a drum machine called the Tempest, a DSI instrument, which it's an analog drum machine that has some leads and bass sounds in there as well. And I find it very, very easy to make, the first loops and things to get my ears going. So I'll start on one of those things, an acoustic guitar or else on that, more or less.
yeah,
That's where to start songs. So I keep it simple
yeah,
as simple as I can. I don't want to make these aren't 10-minute epics. They're about the writing and the experiences of my life being written down and spoken. Yeah, and also I don't want to overproduce them, so I'm not going into a big fat studio spending money getting a really heavy engineer in there and making them sound really really good.
hmm,
Uh, I mean, I obviously want to make them listenable, but I also want them to have a little bit of a home studio DIY sound to it,
yeah.
definitely. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I guess like yeah, there's so many avenues we could go. I'll talk about I guess just like you've been very gracious with your time. I don't want to take up too much
No,
more of
no
it.
worries, no worries.
I want to talk actually Andy Rourke, late great Andy Rourke from Smiths. It's very strange. You mentioned like so. I believe you met him through your work with Dark. Um,
No,
oh, is
no.
that not incorrect?
I
Sorry.
met Andy first, probably 10 years before that.
Okay.
I met him on tour when I was in the Glass, and he was touring America as a DJ at the time. And we ended up on a couple of the same stages, and we became friends on a couple of tours. First time I met him was at an indie club in San Francisco. I forget what it's called now. It was like through the 2000s, it was like the place you wanted to play in America if you were an
Yeah.
indie band. It was in San Francisco. So I met him there. and then we ended up realizing we lived near each other in Brooklyn, and so I actually remixed a couple of his. He remixed DJ Wool and The Glass, both the acts I was doing, and then I ended up remixing a precursor of Dark called Jet Lag.
Okay.
So we've done a few records together, and that's how my name ended up in the hat for the Dark record. Was that I'd already kind of had an ongoing. I didn't know Dolores. I had an ongoing relationship with him and his engineering partner, and
Okay.
we drank a lot together and had
Um,
fun.
it's kind of like strange, like to think like they're like both gone. Like I remember like it's weird because like I had no personal relationship with him, obviously, but like every now and again, like someone like it will hit you, and he was one. Grant Hart was one. There's been like a few of those like artists where it's like like I don't know, just it like hit you like, oh, you're never gonna have the opportunity to see them, or
Yeah,
um
I have a bunch of unfinished tracks.
yeah.
You know, I have some beautiful music here that Dolores has done that will maybe never come out. I have loads of vocal takes. I have funny covers of old Irish songs she's done. I have 5 or 6 bass lines that of Andy's that will never come out. Yeah.
It must be like a very strange position to be in, because on the one hand it's like, you know that like, the people who are fans and the people who've kind of like followed them would obviously love to hear that stuff, but at the same time it's like, well, is it my right to
It's
release this
not.
stuff?
It's not.
Exactly.
It's
So
not.
it must be a very conflicting feeling though.
I think with Andy, there's a feeling of gratitude for that period of my life because as a teenager in the late 80s, like, and being a creative person or whatever you want to call it, the Smiths were essential to my survival.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
everything, like they were there for me when I was a teenager, that they were there. That music was there for me. Those albums were like, I leaned on them heavily. So the first time I met him, I was absolutely blown away. I think it was probably the only time in my life I was properly starstruck.
Right.
And of course, you didn't get away with that bullshit with Andy. He was just totally like mellow, you know. So yeah, there with him. It's there was a personal relationship and a friendship, and when we were mixing that album. I was living in the Dark album. I was living in California, and he came out a couple of times to stay out there and come to my studio and help finish it off. So there's amazing memories of that.
Mhm.
Um, on the side of Dolores, there's just a sadness because although she was famous, my interactions with her were always as a friend.
Yeah.
So even though we didn't spend a lot of time in the studio together, I would do it when she wasn't there, comping vocals and things like that. So my communications with her were, we were both in California at one point, and we didn't. She was in LA and I was San Francisco, and she'd like just FaceTime me to show me an apartment she was looking at, or should I buy this telly, or you know what I mean? It was more like mundane like that.
Yeah.
It wasn't a rock star situation. I mean, when we went on tour, maybe it was a little different because you have all sorts of characters involved and power struggles, but not with her. With her, it was just a friendly kind of. She was quite maternal and took really good care of me. So, I miss that odd phone call from someone who was so colorful and so interesting and intelligent and fucking, a privilege to know,
Yeah.
like today is actually, I think, or maybe it was yesterday, is the anniversary of her death, 6 years. So, when I woke up, there was a lot of messages and different things on Instagram, and most of them were from people who were like, oh, our lives changed that day she left.
Mm.
So to the privilege of knowing somebody who had that influence on so many people is super cool. And the privilege of knowing someone like Andy who had that privilege, that influence on me is, yeah, I'm beyond like blessed and lucky. Like, and I mean, maybe that's why I have the confidence to continue making music, is if people like that believe that I had something to offer, maybe I do. Still have imposter syndrome like everybody else, but there's been a number of characters, not just those two in my life, who've had a large influence. So, for myself, I think that definitely gives me I maybe the motivation to keep going, maybe the fact that they're not here is like, well, I'll keep going.
Yeah.
I'll keep doing what we did. And if they saw something in me, well, I can see it too, somehow.
That's perfect. I think I've asked everything I have to ask.
Okay.
I guess the final thing I'll just say is like so for 2024 you have the album coming out 9th of February, just to plug. It's 9th of February
9th
it's
of
coming out.
February, Def Nettle album is out. Yeah. And
The
the
gigs
launch,
the day before.
yeah, February 8th is the launch at Whelan's with
Yeah.
the Nil.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah, yeah.
It's that main room or upstairs?
Upstairs.
Okay, perfect.
I don't think we
Um
can fill the main room yet. I
but
don't know
beyond
if we're
that,
going to
so
fill the upstairs. So buy
beyond
tickets,
that,
go upstairs.
what's your plans for, I guess, the year?
Um, you know, my I've been building towards the album for a year. So honestly, 6 months for the 6 months leading up to December of 2023, my mom had cancer,
Oh
and I
shit,
had to
sorry.
kind of refocus my attention a bit. She passed away on Christmas Day. So
Jeez,
I've
sorry to
only
hear.
been back to work about a week. We've got another show in Limerick on February 23rd, and the album and the launch are my main focus, and then the show in Limerick on the 23rd. Um, and that's what I'm focused on for now, is getting that right, because I had to take a few weeks out of focusing on Def Nettle in order to, take care of my mom before she passed, and get over it myself for the last few weeks and deal with that. So I'm
Yeah.
really just back to work less than a week. But
And
we're gonna play shows and we're gonna put out loads more music.
oh,
Definitely.
perfect.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. As soon as the record's out, I've already written a load of the lyrics. I'm already starting the second album.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just briefly talk about that. You were mentioned I guess like how do you find the second record? Like, do you have ideas for what that's going to be, and do you feel how do you feel it's going to differ? I guess from this first record.
I think this record was even though loads of people came and helped out and played on it, it was I was the driving force behind it. So a lot of it was done at my house in my studio. Um, Drums and stuff, a lot were done remotely. On the new one, I want, and there's loads of different musicians, including the people who are in the live band now. The second one, I want it to be mostly the live band now, because we're tight and we've rehearsed a lot. So
Yeah,
I'll bring the song ideas mostly, but then I'll have them play them the way they want to. So instead of it just being like, okay, I made this beat recreated on drums, or I played this guitar, play it nicer with a better amp. It'll be, here's the basic, vocal melody and drum pattern. Now do with it what you will, so that it's hopefully be more of a co-write with the rest of the band, as opposed to me being like tricky, or you know what I mean, someone on their own. You know what I
but
mean? I That's what I'm hoping anyway. So.
perfect. Thanks very much for your time, man. I
Oh,
really
thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much. I appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to that episode of Post-Burnout.com interviews. If you liked it, please subscribe and stick around, because we have plenty more like this coming soon.